Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our March webinar. I'm Jessie McClellan, the Executive Director of the Georgia Arborist Association. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I always like to give people a couple of minutes to trickle in and just talk to you for a minute about some of the upcoming things and some housekeeping for this webinar. So we'll get started here in just a minute. As always, if you have questions during the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring the Q&A as we go along and asking Mark those questions as they come up. So feel free to ask questions as they pop into your head, and I will find a natural break in the conversation to ask Mark your questions. So please feel free to do that. There is one ISA CEU for this event, and as always, I will put a survey in the chat at the end for you to fill out, and if you fill that out, I will submit your ISA number for credit for the CEU. So that, again, that will come at the very end of the presentation, so keep a lookout for that. There is also a place to provide feedback in that survey. And I really hope that, and I'll say this again at the end, I hope that you will provide feedback to me. I read every single one of your comments and try to plan these webinars based on what you want to learn about. So I don't know if you don't tell me, so please share your feedback with me so that we can always provide better content. The next webinar that we have on the schedule is part of our ongoing series on the business of arboriculture. That next webinar is March 27th, and that topic is going to be taxes and business setup. That, as always, is free for anyone who would like to attend. So that's a lunch and learn. It'll be at 1 p.m. on March 27th. You can find information about that on our website. And then next month's webinar is also going to be a lunch and learn. That topic is on landscape architecture and arborists and collaboration between the two. So I really hope you'll join us for that as well. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our speaker for this evening. Welcome, Dr. Mark Czarnota, who is an associate professor at the Department of Horticulture at the University of Georgia Griffin Campus. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mark.
Great. Thanks. Can you hear me fine?
I can, yeah.
Okay, so I can get started now?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. So anyway, I'm glad thanks for having me, and hopefully I'll be able to pass some information on and knowledge on the people about herbicide damage in trees that I often see that I think a lot of people miss. And unfortunately, there's not much research done in this area. There needs to be more, but I can tell you what I've experienced in the past 30 years. I guess I've been doing this as at least a graduate student and then a faculty member. I've been here at the University of Georgia for just started my 24th year. But anyway, let me see if it'll work now. How do we get to? So I just got to figure out when to forward it. Can I use my keyboard, or I got to use something on the screen?
To share your screen?
No, you can see my screen, correct? Or
no, I see your face now. So you have to
okay, gotcha. All right, gotcha. I just didn't know what you saw me. Now I gotta hit share. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so anyway, I guess we can get started. And then I gotta figure out why is it not? What do I gotta do something? Do I click the button? There it is. Okay, I got to use my buttons on my mouse. All right. So the history of, I guess, a little bit about me. I got a few slides here to talk about what I do and where I'm at, and where I'm from. But I'm a native of Pennsylvania. I grew up there in southern Chester County, right on the Maryland-Delaware border. I went to the University of Delaware for a bachelor's degree. I worked for about 3 years before going back for my master's degree at Virginia Tech. And then I finished at Cornell, but I went through University of Kentucky. I was at for about 2.5 years and left there and went to Cornell with my advisor, who had my boss basically, who changed positions and took me with her. So I guess she thought I was valuable enough to take me with her. She took myself actually and a technician. I'm an associate professor, extension specialist at the University of Georgia Griffin Campus. I have a 58% extension appointment, 22% research appointment, 5% teaching appointment, and a 15% service appointment. I handle some administrative stuff in our department on campus, dealing with budgetary items and construction and making sure that the university provides us as much adequate funding as we can for some infrastructure stuff. But my position when I got hired was to cover all aspects of weed control. And I call myself the bastard weed scientist. I do all the crops no one cares about, but I do weed control and ornamentals, small fruits, orchard floor management, Christmas trees, and flower culture. And all those are very, very similar. I get lots and lots of herbicide questions from most of the growers throughout the state, and all those herbicides are very similar. They go? I guess they're utilized in pretty much all those categories I deal with, a lot of them with different names, but so it kind of serves well to do what I do and the crops I deal with. Just some stuff I wanted to show you what I have to deal with constantly. This is one of the first things I had to work with when I got here. This is just some weed problems in blackberries. We have about 4 or 5 thousand acres of blackberries in the state now. This is an issue where they actually have plastic down, and this weed called purple nutsedge comes through. I work closely with a chemical company to get a product registered in the state so they can control this, because when you have weed problems this bad, it really cuts into the actual yield of the crop, and it's something I do. Some of you might recognize the weed growing in this container. This is an azalea. This would be a container operation. I had to advise people on how to get rid of this, because we have guys with 3-4 acres of these with this. It's called Morcanthia, growing in a container with a azalea, and we actually found a great fungicide that controlled it, but unfortunately we couldn't get it registered. This was back about 15 years ago, and basically they could use some pre-emergent herbicides and change the media and the watering machine to try to get rid of this. This would be a typical bald and burlap operation. This is actually right behind my house at Mid Georgia Nursery. They have about 400 acres of ground trees. They do a very good job of growing trees there. And I consult with him a little bit on weed control and how to keep things clean. Here, the weed control is pretty much failing at this point. It's midsummer, and he's going to have to come through here with some grass herbicides and put down a pre-emergent herbicide to keep a 4-foot swath in amongst those southern magnolias to keep them clean and maximize the growth. This is actually at Schmidt's when I visited out there in Oregon. This is a really good example. There was some ash trees they had where they actually do cultivation and a lot of herbicides, and excellent operation, but I was able to observe really good weed control at this operation. So anyway, but the goals of today is to talk about herbicide injury in trees, the reason it happens, what it looks like, and can the trees recover? I mean, that's what I'm hopefully pass along some of the knowledge that I have. It was very difficult for me to condense this down into a meaningful talk. So I'm sure we have people with varied backgrounds, and so people might understand stuff and think it's some of the stuff I present is really rudimentary, and some of the stuff they want more information. And we have time. I guess you could ask me, and I'll try to answer the question as quickly as I can and move on. But I think it's useful if you ask during the time if you have any questions, and I'll try to answer it. But anyway, so hopefully we'll learn some stuff here. As far as first I have to talk a little bit about weed control, weed science is what we call it. Some of you might have had a weed science class if you went to and got a bachelor's degree in agriculture or horticulture. Most land grant universities have weed science classes, and you learn about ways to control weeds, why there are problems, different ways to control them, all kind of things. And so anyway, but I to peel everything down, when I teach a weed science class or the lab that I teach, why do we control weeds? And it's the main reason we do it is because of plant competition. If you got turf grass, you got a lot of broadleaf weeds, you're trying to grow turf grass, you don't want that, so you try to get rid of it. And then of course, when I'm dealing with containerized ornamentals, if you remember that Morcanthia slide I had, if you have all that Morcanthia growing in that azalea pot, your azalea is not going to get out to full production where you can actually sell the plant to somebody to purchase it very quickly. And that's the main reason I have a job. But they're all, controlling weeds is also for it. It's, weeds are a host for insects and diseases. And the main reason we do it in the landscape situation is for beauty. But unfortunately, a lot of the herbicides that we use can cause a lot of collateral damage, and that's what I really want to focus on. And I finally became a certified arborist, I guess about 4 or 5 years, about 4 years ago, 3 years ago, I can't remember now. Always interested in it. Wish I would have got into it earlier. But one of the things that I was very disappointed as a faculty member when I was taking the test is there was really no herbicide information in there. And I can't tell you the number of trees that I see often where I see damage from herbicides. I know it's herbicide damage and people are just totally oblivious to it. So hopefully I can make you start to think about that. Uh, when you look at a tree, particularly on like university campuses or any type of hospital campus or these gated communities, that's really where I see it often, because people that are controlling the turf grass weeds there often way over apply herbicides. And when that happens, it can be millions of dollars in damage that people aren't paying for that they should, because they're damaging the trees. So hopefully if you deal with any of this where you have to maintenance trees in areas like this, you can start to like maybe question or at least look out for things and become a better steward of the environment and the landscape, and try to make people aware of what they might be doing that negatively impacts trees. So if I was teaching you a weed science class, or at least that I teach for weed control, and a lot of the hands-on classes, normally control there's physical removal of weeds, there's physical barriers you can put down to keep weeds from growing and basically smother them or the seed that are trying to germinate. There's biocontrol, which there's not much of that going on. There is some, and there's examples of that with thistle weevil and other things I'd love to talk about, and my PhD actually dealt with that. So the doctorate degree I worked on was with we found out if you plant grain sorghum, and you try to crop back with other plants like soybeans, the plants normally didn't do well after you overcropped with something else after sorghum, and they didn't know why. And anyway, basically we found out there was an exudate coming from sorghum that stuck around in the soil that was very similar to some synthetic herbicides. And then I was able to find a way to turn it off and turn it on in sorghum, meaning we could find a gene. And of course, the guy that was a PhD student after me took that gene and then tried to place it in other plants, overexpress it like in rice, and get rice to produce a herbicide naturally. So, and it would be similar to what you'd see if many of you know about black walnut, and it produces juglone, which a lot of plant material does not grow well around black walnuts, because basically they produce a chemical that basically kills everything else out or makes it really sick so it can get all the nutrients and water. So anyway, that's kind of what I worked on. But the biggest thing, I get more questions than anything else, is chemical weed control. And there's a lot of people out there that might be organic, and that's fine. And I could tell you, I would be the first one to raise my hand if we could get rid of all the pesticides out there, because I personally think there's not a herbicide out there that doesn't cause damage to the plants that damage to the plants that they're utilized in. The problem, the good thing is that it gets rid of the weeds that are going to damage the plant worse than what the herbicides are doing. So it's all about risk management. And as we move forward, when I'm teaching a weed science class, I always tell people, I don't know if we'll be using herbicides 50 years from now. I really don't know, because there's going to be, you're starting to see these robots and all these drone type devices that they can utilize, and it's just going to get more and more popular. And as we move forward, there's just a negative view of any chemical or type weed control. We're moving more and more away from that. And if we could actually get people to accept GMO crops a little bit more, that actually gives us a tool where we can get rid of a lot of pesticides, period, not just herbicides, but fungicides and insecticides as well. So anyway, but we're going to talk about chemical weed control, because that's the thing that a little bit I have to talk about here that causes problems with the trees.
Hey, Mark.
Yep.
We did have a question come up in the Q&A.
Yep.
Have you done work with weed suppression utilizing fire, and are there any benefits to that method?
Oh yeah, certainly. Great question. Of course, forestry is a method where where that's mainly used as, but they use it also in uh, in what do I want to say, in forages. So it works well. They're way cheaper than herbicides. You just it has to be managed. Usually have a Department of Forestry that will help guide you through when to do it, how to do it, and how to do it safely. And of course, it all has to do with air quality. There's several counties in the state where you can burn pretty much all any time of year as long as the conditions are right. And then there's lots of places like where I live in Pike County, where you can only burn from October to you can only burn from October 1st till May 1st. So, but it's an excellent way of weed control, and a lot of people utilize it. It works real well on getting rid of things like privet, thin skin plant material and stuff like that. But again, it's very useful. So anyway, but of course the fields I deal with, they don't use fire very often. So it's mainly the biggest tool that most people use it at is in forestry. So anyway, hold on here. Sorry, my phone's ringing. Never fails. Uh, there we go. Got it off. So chemical weed control is usually the last alternative, usually combined with other control measures. Products are safe when they're used properly. They've been vetted out very by many groups in by the EPA and many other organizations here in our country. And then they're easy to use, save hours of labor. And if we were teaching a weed science class, I can tell you that 3 herbicides had a huge impact on food production in the U.S. And that would have been 2,4-D, atrazine, and glyphosate. And they simply changed our abilities to produce food in the world. When 2,4-D came out in the early 1940s, corn production went up from like 10, 15 bushels an acre to like 40. And that was outstanding. And then, of course, that was when they had to mix 2,4-D and basically diesel fuel, spray it over wheat or corn, about half kill the wheat or corn, but it would come out of that and then grow and produce, 4 times the amount of yield that it would. Atrazine came out and gave us an ability to pretty much produce nothing but corn out west until resistance came in and it fell out of favor. And of course, glyphosate came in the early 70s, and of course, when GMO crops when plants started getting genetically modified with glyphosate, that really changed things and gave us a tool until plants became resistant to glyphosate. Now it really changed things in row crop production. So, but I only have 2,4-D that I deal with, and in the crops I deal with, I don't. The atrazine's not really available in any of the crops I deal with, and of course glyphosate's utilized by many people. So anyway, and it also causes lots of tree problems, and so does 2,4-D. It's one of the big 5 that I'm going to talk about here. So anyway, so if you're listening here, if you never had a weed science class, you might want to pay attention here because this is some really juicy information here. So, and with herbicides, they're basically divided up into 2 categories. We either have pre-emergent herbicides or post-emergent herbicides. So pre-emergent herbicides are generally applied before to bare soil or mulch before germination of the weed seed. And then you need water to activate these herbicides. That's what they mean by activation, to move these herbicides in the zone of seed germination. Most of the pre-emergent herbicides are not very water soluble, and you're lucky to get them to move into the top ½ inch of the soil. They stay there, and then when the seeds germinate, the first thing to come out is a radical, which is the first root, and then of course the hypocotyl comes out, and they come in contact with some of these herbicide molecules, and these molecules actually shut down certain biopathways in the plant. A lot of times it won't kill the plant, but it damages that little seedling so bad that it can't grow and it ends up succumbing and dying, which is a good thing when you're trying to grow corn or beans or other things. So, and then there's post-emergent herbicides, and these can cause problems with the trees that we all deal with in arboriculture. And they're applied anytime after the seeds have germinated or seeds have germinated. So you have green tissue, and then they need a certain period of dryness after you apply these products. And there are a lot of herbicides out there that they can put out when the plants are dormant and still control them, but generally they work much better when there's green foliage out. Okay. So there's basically those 2 types of herbicides. So of these type of herbicides, the pre and post herbicides, each of those can be selective or non-selective. So selective herbicides control a certain group of plants but are safe on others, and that would be like the growth regulator herbicides like 2,4-D. So they generally control broadleaf weeds, and grasses are able to metabolize that 2,4-D molecule and basically make it inactive. And there are plenty of broadleaf plants that are very, very tolerant of it. And then there's and that being said, herbicides, all plant material have different tolerances of herbicides, and that's something to remember too. So because a lot of them can take a certain amount, they can absorb a certain amount of like 2,4-D or glyphosate. You won't see any activity, but once you get over a certain level in the plant, they'll start to manifest damage, and that's what this is all about. So, and then the other type of selectivity of non-selective herbicides that control all plants they come in contact with, and that would be like Roundup with glyphosate. So you should, most everyone's familiar with that. So you treat a plant, spray a plant with it. The plant takes that herbicide in, and glyphosate actually cuts off the production of three amino acids: tryptophan, phenylalanine, and tyrosine. The plant can't make those amino acids and ends up succumbing because there's a whole cascade of events that we really don't understand, and the plant will end up dying. So, but of course that pathway we don't have in our bodies, and that's what makes glyphosate safe to us, most pretty much every mammal, because, or any animal, because we just don't have those pathways. But it's still a pesticide. I'm sure you're aware of all the lawsuits going on about it, but I don't want to get into that. But anyway, so that those are the two type of herbicides that the pre and post herbicides can be selective and non-selective, and that selectivity is really what we hunt for, because I wish we had a herbicide out there that would control every willow weed that I've come in contact with, but that's not the case. And we really rely heavily on pre-emergent herbicides in the landscape, particularly turf grass, to keep out annual weeds. So so anyway, some herbicides can provide both pre and post activity. So I'm not telling you all the story here. So I'm trying to tell you that, yeah, some of these herbicides don't have gray areas, but there are some that do not. So you might be familiar with a product called Prowl or pendimethalin. It's sold under a lot of different trade names. That product, used in normal conditions, will not have any post-emergent activity whatsoever. It's only a pre-emergent herbicide. They're called, that product is called a DNA type herbicide, and then there are a certain group of herbicide, if you're familiar with how pesticides are categorized, and then that product, they only have pre-emergent activity, so you can spray over top of most actively grown plant material and not have problems. And then there's post-emergent herbicides like Roundup. Roundup has zero pre-emergent activity if used at labeled rates. So you basically can spray glyphosate and be slit seeding right behind it, like corn or soybeans, which is what they used to do when they were used heavily into no-till agriculture. They could do that and get away with it because glyphosate has very little very little absorption from the soil. It basically bonds up to the soil particles irreversibly and is broke down about every 40 days. A half-life occurs, meaning about half the product that you put out. So if you put out a pound of product per acre, about every 40 days, if you went back and tried to pull that off the soil, you would only be able to get off about a half pound, and usually 3 half-lives, and you can't find the product anymore. And then there's a lot of products that fall into the pre-post activity, and one of those that was really common when I first got here was it's called Image, to control purple nutsedge, and it's called imazaquin, but it has both pre and post activity, which can be very problematic in certain situations with trees. So anyway, so and the other thing, yep, you say something. The other,
Yeah.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
No, somebody ask a question.
Yes, we did have a question in the Q&A.
Yeah, go
Does
ahead.
cutting a weed back before herbicide application enhance its intake into weed?
Okay, I'd have to ask that person a few questions, but generally, if you're cutting back like a herb type plant, like a herbaceous plant, it's going to hurt that. So herbaceous plants, you want the foliage to come up to make if you're doing a post-emergent application, to absorb it. But now, if you're trying to control a tree, or like let's say a seedling oak or a seedling pine, where you cut it off and painted the stump, you can do that and get pretty good control. But you want to do it within 30 minutes after you cut it, and then that'll provide control. And there's lots of herbicides. Usually it's either triclopyr, which you know is Garlon, glyphosate, which you know is Roundup, or Arsenal, which you know is imazapyr. Those three are the big popular ones. But that question I'd have to ask a few more to exactly know out. But if you're talking about herbaceous plant material, no, it causes it does not enhance the activity of the herbicide. It actually decreases it. So another thing we need to clear up, a lot of people get confused about the term systemic. Is the herbicide systemic? Most of the post-emergent herbicides would be systemic. Most of the pre-emergent herbicides are not, but there are some that are. So, and then the ones I listed, like for example, Prowl, it's not systemic, so it doesn't move through the plant. So you put it out on the, on the soil, prevent the seeds from germinating. But if you put the rates out too high, you can get root damage on the tree. It wouldn't really kill the tree, but it could reduce the growth. And if it's continually used at too high of a rate, it really can drag the tree down, making it more susceptible for insect and disease infections. So that's something to be on the lookout, the lookout for. And then there's post-emergent herbicides like glyphosate. That product is phloem loaded. It's systemic. Those two things mean the same thing, but it can't be absorbed by the root material. It has to be sprayed onto the shoot in order to be moved around in the plant. And then the product like Image or Mazaquin, it would be also systemic, and it can be absorbed by the roots of the plant or through the foliage. And that all has to do with how that herbicides, how they react with the soil. A lot of people get confused about this. And this has a lot to do with the soil's pH. The higher the pH, usually the more available it is to other plants growing around. And then and usually how much organic matter is in the soil can also tie things up a bit and reduce the amount that gets into the plant. But those two things are the soil. I can't stress more to you. That's why it's so important to take soils classes to kind of understand what's going on. But the soil is a very, very active matrix, and has all kind of plus and minus charges that are affected by pH, and that affects how available these herbicides can be to the trees. So anyway, now tree and shrub exposure to herbicides. Weed control in ornamentals, ornamental beds, turf grass, agricultural fields, and roadside brush control are probably the four main ways that trees are going to be exposed to herbicides. And then ways herbicides enter woody plant material are through the foliage, which would be drift or direct spray contact, or root absorption. Those are really the only two ways that they can get in, or that are really the ways they're going to get in. And a small group of these herbicides are responsible for most of the tree damage I see. In the past 30 years, I've come down to 5 herbicides that I see just about all the time causing problems. And that doesn't mean there's other ones out there that don't cause issues. I call those outlier events. But the 5 that I am going to mention are very, very, very common. So, and then the other thing to remember is most woody plant material can survive a certain amount of herbicide exposure before manifesting damage. So we call this loading in science, basically. So if you went and tested the plant material, for example, glyphosate, you sprayed it at the base of a tree or a crepe myrtle, it can take some of that. You could even find a little bit of it in the plant material, but it's not manifesting damage. But for some reason, when you hit a certain level in the plant, it'll start to manifest damage. And usually by that point, when I start seeing damage, that means trouble has started. And then you get to the point of whether or not the tree is going to come back or not. And it can be very difficult to decide whether or not to remove the tree, keep the tree. And we're going to talk just a little bit about that. Okay, now the herbicide trees hate. Okay, I'm going to call them the big 5 is what I decided to call them. But herbicides that cause the biggest problems with woody plants are growth regulator herbicides, and these are the group 4 herbicides. And if you look at these containers on here, they usually have a group on that little black label on the glyphosate. That would be that's a group 9 herbicide actually, and then the group 2 herbicides will be ones like the Arsenal herbicide that you see here. And Arsenal is a really bad problem with trees, and usually if you damage a tree with Arsenal, it's not going to come back, and it might be alive, but it's not worth keeping. But there's other herbicides that can be problems, and I'll talk about 2 or 3 of those at the end. And they're pre-emergent herbicides that actually can be can cause problems, and they're quite unique. But anyway, Trimec, that Trimec Classic product that you see there, that's actually a three-way herbicide, and then it has three different actually growth regulator herbicides in there. But the biggest one that causes a problem, it has 2,4-D in it, which sometimes isn't such a problem with trees, but it has dicamba. Dicamba is a big time no-no around trees or tree drip lines. So that's something that you want to try to avoid around that. But if you come into a situation where the trees look like some of the pictures I'm going to show you, that should set some bells off that I would start looking around where this tree's growing, what kind of management's being done under the drip line or closely around the drip line that could cause problems. So now the big five that the last 25 years that I've had to deal with more than anything would be 2,4-D, dicamba, triclopyr, imazapyr, and glyphosate. So the 2,4-D, dicamba, and triclopyr, these are all growth regulator type herbicides. And if you took a herbicide metabolism class, you learn all about this and what they do. And even in a weed science class, they divide these three growth regulator herbicides up into subcategories, and each one of those is in a different subcategory. 2,4-D is in an auxin category, dicamba is what we call benzoic acids, and triclopyr is in a picolinic acids. But they all cause different a little bit different symptomologies, but they're all similar. And then all the plant material can be tolerant to like 2,4-D, but not tolerant to dicamba or triclopyr. So there's different tolerance levels to each of these. And 2,4-D, for example, that can be found naturally in plant material. But when you put it in at too high of a rate, then we got problems. And then the other two products, the imazapyr and the glyphosate, those are these are amino acid inhibiting herbicides, and of course glyphosate, I already told you, inhibits those three they call them the aromatic amino acids, and then imazapyr inhibits leucine, isoleucine, and valine. And those three are again, both of those products work on pathways that are not in animal species. So they're considered very safe, like to us, but they're still pesticides, but they don't work on any pathways we have in our bodies. So all these products are systemic. So, and that makes them a problem. And then the only one, and all of them can be, except for glyphosate, can be absorbed either by foliar or soil applications. So if you get too much of it, the rate's too high around the base of the plant, they can be absorbed. So, but anyway, these are the big five. So if you try to remember these and start learning about what they look like when their damage occurs, it can really help you kind of treat the plant, or even start questioning the management around the tree, and maybe get people to stop putting these herbicides down around the tree. Now, these are common pictures that I come across. I can't tell you how many times I've seen 2,4-D or dicamba damage. It's just too much to even mention. And then, unfortunately, the tree to the right, that tree right there has no hope. And this was quite an interesting scenario that occurred up in North Georgia. These trees this was a big gated community. They had all these oaks basically planted. There were hundreds of them, probably 400 or 500 in this community, and a lot of them look like the tree you see to your right. That tree was this around here. The guy called. I got a call from an extension to come in and look at this, and they thought there were some disease problems. But when I got up there and started looking at these, it was obvious to me there was herbicide damage. And then the thing that was really obvious, there was absolutely no broadleaf weeds growing anywhere. I couldn't find any. So I started questioning who was managing the turf grass. And basically it turned out that they were putting down 3-4 applications of Trimec per year. And about 3-4 years into this, after they had established these trees, they were starting to manifest damage. And I could tell you the tree to the right's not going to come back in a reasonable amount of time. It had to be removed and replanted, but there's problems with carryover of this soil. So they had to actually wait about a year before they could come back and start replanting, because they had the rate so high of this herbicide. And what's so sad is, if they would have contacted people in our department about how to manage weeds in that community, they could have used some pre-emergent herbicides. And they also needed to come up with some threshold value to only come back and treat with broadleaf herbicides like 2,4-D and dicamba, or the Trimec product they were using. And basically when they hit, I don't know, 2 plants per square foot, then they should treat. But that would only be once every 2 or 3 years, if that. And this entire damage would have been avoided, and they could have saved themselves millions of dollars that I'm sure they had to pay to replace these trees. So anyway, but this is a classic damage. You get what we call epinasty. You can see the leaves aren't unfolding right. And you'll start to get sections of the tree to die. Some people might think that it's a disease problem, but if you really start looking close and you're exposed to these type things, you'll start to realize that, hey, something's not right here, and then start questioning what they've been doing around the base of that plant or around the area, and that's what happened. So anyway, but that's 2,4-D damage. Triclopyr damage can be quite interesting too, and this was one that I had to deal with in citrus, where they actually were spraying an area for pine. They actually to beyond in the fields beyond the citrus orchard here. This guy had about 10 acres of citrus. Pretty much all the trees towards that fence row, where all the trees you can see there. You can see a lot of dead trees there. This is in July. All those trees should be leafed out. They're not. They put herbicides out with a drone. The winds were up to about 15 miles an hour when they made that application, and unfortunately drifted over into the citrus farm and caused quite a bit of damage there, several $100,000 worth of damage, and then of course killed all the guys' trees on the tree line. So, but if you got up close to those trees, you started seeing this type of damage, real epinastic damage, like I said, where the trees foliage isn't unfurling out. And these are willow oaks or laurel oaks, I think, if I remember correctly. And then these trees, again, probably were never going to come back and had to be removed, but it was in a fence row, so I don't know what he did with them, if he even cared. But the person was trying to say that he didn't cause the problem, and unfortunately I had to write a letter saying that he did cause this damage. And then, in fact, the litigation on this is still going on. So, but anyway, but the triclopyr look very similar to that, as you can see. And then
Hey,
the last, yeah, go ahead.
Do you perform a foliar and soil analysis to confirm the root cause?
Yeah, I was going to talk about that, but yes, you can. I can tell you that right now. There's a couple things you can do. You can send a tissue out for analysis. It's about $250 a sample. There's several labs here. We have one in our state called Waters, but there's also several labs out west that will do that to confirm that. The only problem is that a lot of times they're missed, particularly with the growth regulator herbicides, particularly with 2,4-D, it being a native compound in the plant. It sometimes gets lost or at too low of a level that it will cause the damage, and then the level will get too low on the plant and you won't be able to find it. That also can happen with dicamba. So you'll see the plant manifest all this damage, but yet you can't find it. You can do actually do soil bioassays yourself, where you can dig the soil. I recommend people to dig up the top 2 inches of soil around the plant, fill up like 6 or 10 6-inch pots. You can plant an indicator species. Any kale, collards, mustard greens are very, very sensitive to any soil contaminants. You would compare that to a known clean soil and then see if there's any differences in there, just to first identify, okay, there's a contaminant in the soil, and then try to find it. And then in the soils, if you found it with the seedling indicator species I mentioned, usually you can send those soils off and they'll be able to pull it off that soil to do that. But for example, with glyphosate, they wouldn't be able to get glyphosate off the soil. They actually have to use acids. They really have to know what they're doing. And a lot of times they've missed it. And then I've unfortunately have sent water samples in, spiked the sample, and these labs miss them a lot of times because the herbicides will bond up to the dirty water, those soil particles in the water, and get filtered out when they try to shoot it through. It's basically a HPLC mass spec system, and it has to be very clean, filtered exudate that they're pulling, either grinding the plant tissue off. So they do separation series to do that, but that has to be very clean, and a lot of times they'll lose the baby with the bath water, I guess, to tell you that. Now, imazapyr, back to that this is another herbicide that it's a growth regulator type herbicide, and you'll start to see what I call bud blasting. And this is really common in just about any tree. There's our shrub, there's oleander here to the right, and just crepe myrtle to the left. And this is where some imazapyr had gotten sprayed under under power lines, and it caused drift, and or not even drift. This is where they were treating too close to the plant. The plant absorbed this through its root system, and this is the type of damage that you'll see. It'll tend to go to the growing point of the plant, and this is the type of damage that you'll see from these type products. Glyphosate is probably the most common thing I see with drift problems. I could show you oodles of pictures of this, and I really don't want to bore you with it, but again, it's going to be this bud blasting type thing. Generally, this is one. I see this in crepe myrtles more than anything in the landscape. I can't tell you how many crepe myrtles I've seen damaged by this, and it's because the people spray the base of the plant. It's a thin-skinned plant. It can be absorbed through the bark. It moves to the growing points of the plant, and you get this bud blasting effect. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. The picture to the top right was a guy that they had about 10 acres of crepe myrtles. He was growing standard crepe myrtles. They were spraying at the base of the plant, cutting all the suckers off, and all those suckers were being exposed to the herbicide, and then just carrying it right up there. But this same scenario can happen in trees, and it can be a very difficult situation to deal with. So how do you ID how to ID damage and know what it is? Like, I guess we just talked about it a little bit. If you were doing this, first thing questions that I ask myself is, where's the woody plant located? Is it growing in turf grass? If it is, then the red flags that go up are 2,4-D, dicamba, and other growth regulator herbicides that they use in turf grass to control broadleaf weeds. If it's growing next to a power line, imazapyr is by far the biggest culprit. It is just lethally toxic to woody plant material, any woody plant material. Triclopyr is another one. The way I can tell the two apart is that if there's any grass species that are left, it's generally triclopyr. If it's killed everything and there's nothing growing around that tree, it's usually imazapyr. There's another one called picloram, which is called tordon, that is also lethally toxic to woody plant material. And so those can be really problematic under any type of power lines, or when they're doing applications with backpacks. Usually if they're doing backpack applications under power lines, they're using triclopyr, because that one is one where you can maintain the turf grass cover and avoid any erosion issues and kill off the broadleaf weeds that can grow up into the power lines. And then if you're in row crop fields, the big three are 2,4-D, dicamba, and glyphosate. And that's because we have GMO modified crops in cotton, soybeans, and corn, and those products can drift over when they're doing either aerial applications or the big spray rig applications. If they're close to any desirable trees, they can easily drift up onto the trees if you're next to those. And again, I've been involved in many cases with these and lots of drift applications. One of the ones I have in the top here is bamboo. Yes, bamboo is desirable sometimes, and I really think we're going to see more and more bamboo grown for fiber and many things here in our state. And there's lots of people starting to plant it for lots of different reasons. But this is where a fella had some, and it was terribly damaged by dicamba. And I actually have other pictures I could have showed you with the glyphosate drift that it was on these, but he had about 10 acres of this, and it was very problematic. So, but the reason I knew it was those two products is because the bamboo was growing right next to a row crop field where they were growing cotton and peanuts, and those two products are glyphosate and dicamba are utilized quite often, and he had extensive damage in his bamboo.
There was a question of trying to control bamboo. Is that what you would recommend to control bamboo, is dicamba?
Oh yeah, well, to control bamboo, no, dicamba is not going to kill it well enough, because bamboo's a grass. But if you use dicamba on it, it can damage it, just like dicamba can damage some of the warm season turf grasses you can't use dicamba on, but it won't kill it, but it'll damage it. For controlling bamboo, by far the best product I've ever tested is Arsenal, the imazapyr. But you have to be so careful about that for collateral damage, because if you treat the bamboo and there's roots of trees growing in that bamboo of desirable trees, that are 30 feet away, it can pick up that herbicide. The herbicide can move into the tree and cause extensive damage that the plant's not going to recover from. So, but anyway, but you can use glyphosate also, and then I have been doing stem injections where I go into the first internode, the top first internode, and I squirt in about 5 mils of Arsenal, and any bamboo that's connected to that or growing from that point will be killed, and that way you don't have to spray it. But again, the Arsenal will get into the soil, and you have to be careful about if there's any desirable trees. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, I recommend Arsenal, and if you're out where there's trees around that you don't want to damage, that's where glyphosate's a really good tool, because you don't have to worry so much about the root absorption with glyphosate. But anyway, you can the woody plant recover, and what should you do? I wish I had more information on this, but this is all we have, is how bad is the damage on the tree, and then that's going to come with time and your expertise on looking at that tree and knowing if it's going to come back. And I have some pictures to show you that I can tell you that tree's not going to come back, and the other one is probably a 50-50 chance. And then how long can you wait for the damaged plant to recover? And then this is what, if you're ever been in a as an expert witness, they like using this term will the plant recover in a reasonable amount of time? Well, obviously that's a gray area. What is a reasonable amount of time? And generally that's usually 2 growing seasons, and usually it's 1 for a lot of people, because usually after a year you can pretty much tell if it's going to come back or not. So these are the types of pictures that I like to show people, that, the plants are alive, but do you want these plants in your house? So, and I can tell you the crepe myrtle to the left, that ain't going to come back in a reasonable amount of time, has to be ripped out and replanted. And that's a glyphosate situation. They don't have to worry about carryover in that situation. The plant to the right is I don't know what kind of oak that was. I can't remember. I think that was a red oak. But anyway, that plant also is not going to come back in a reasonable amount of time. That tree needs to be ripped out and replanted. But what I can't tell you is that if there's still enough herbicide in that soil to cause problems. But in that situation, if you couldn't do a test there, what I would do is tear that tree out, bring in fresh soil to pack around the tree when you planted it, and that would give you the best scenario. You wouldn't want to take the soil around that area there and shove it back down into the hole if you had a ball and burlap or even containerized tree, because you're putting contaminated soil in there, and that's not a good thing. So, but anyway, but there's little hope of those trees coming back, if I had to tell you that. And then the ones where there's hope, you can see this is the same area. There was just loads of herbicide damage in this area. Another oak tree, you can see now this tree here, I give this tree some hope. If you go through and prune out the dead material in there, make sure that tree has all the water and nutrients it needs, it's going to come back. The tree to the right was a sycamore tree. Yes, that's a sycamore. And it was damaged by them putting growth regulator herbicides in the turf grass, and they wanted to know if that tree is going to come back. And I'd say yes, that tree's probably going to come back in a reasonable amount of time if they stop using the growth regulator herbicides around the tree twice a year. So, and this was in a situation where they had a turf maintenance company coming through and doing that. So anyway, what do you do? People often ask me, well, what do I do? And you have to prune out the dead plant material, make sure the damaged plant has adequate moisture and nutrients. And usually 1 growing season tells the story. And then, I recommend replanting if not coming back in a reasonable amount of time. And that's usually 1 growing season. I pretty much tell them to rip it out and do a replant. And then, there's issues with replanting, as I mentioned. Many of the herbicides have carryover issues. Lots to learn about herbicides, but a lot of them here in the Southeast, like the 2,4-D, the growth regulator herbicides, they usually won't stay more than about 6 months. So it's not a problem. But if you go up north now in any of the northern states, you get in high pH soils now, you can go to 12 months easily with those growth regulator herbicides. Herbicides like Arsenal, if you go to the Northeast, they can last. Down here, we're lucky for them to last about 6 months. You go to the Northeast, you can get 12 to 24 months. So it can be awful to go back and do a replant, meaning that if that soil was treated with that herbicide, it can stick around in that top 1, 2 to 4 inches of soil. If you would take that soil and throw it around for a repack around a newly planted tree, that's going to damage that tree. And then I always recommend to people that you can do a bioassay yourself. You don't have to pay $250 for a lab. If you just want to identify if there's a contaminant in that soil, you gather up that soil. I usually recommend the top 2 to 4 inches of the soil, and then put that in a 6-inch pot, maybe get 6 of them, use an indicator species. As I mentioned, pretty much any brassica, the kale, collards, mustard, those are very, very sensitive to any type of herbicide in the soil, and you can get damage. And this would be an example that just a dose response that I do, but this would be a perfect example of what you would do. This is a 1 gallon pot. You basically put the seed in that you would want to, like one of the kale or collards. I couldn't find a picture where I actually have done it before. And then you would actually water it, wait about 2 to 4 weeks, and you'd be able to tell particularly if you have any warmer location to grow these. If you're growing them in the summer, you could do it out on your porch, but in the winter you'd have to hopefully get a greenhouse. But you could grow them out really quickly and identify whether or not there's a contaminant in that soil. And if that's the case, you want to wait until you'd want to redo this about every 2 to 3 months to make sure that there's no contaminants in the soil, or there's very limited amounts, so you can utilize or plant back there without damaging a newly planted tree. Glyphosate in ornamentals. What I wanted to mention is, like, remember what I told you, that plants can take a load of this. So that that crepe myrtle I showed you, that's a dose of herbicide that I call, it's not a lethal dose, it's a sublethal dose, but it's causing damage that's it's not going to come back in a reasonable amount of time, and needs to be ripped out. So you can see the picture to the right. Normal foliage on a crepe myrtle would look like the guy on the right, and then to the left would be where a herbicide had gotten in and started to manifest damage. So remember that I'm certain too that plant, the normal looking growth, probably you could find some glyphosate in that, because I got that right out of the field where he had been treating, but it's not high enough to cause damage. So remember that the plant has to pick up enough to get damaged, and that the amount that gets into the plant depends on the herbicide and the plant's sensitivity to it. And what I wish I could do is go into the plant and look at the tissue and know that, let's say I found dicamba at 200 parts per million, I would know that's the cutoff, saying if you got over that, it's a rip out replant. But we have no data to support any of that. And I wish we did, but nobody wants to fund this, and it can be you have to have very expensive equipment to do that. Some other herbicides are problems. Yep, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions if you want to take a minute for questions.
Yep, go ahead. Yeah.
You specifically ask about volatilization. So one is, does Roundup volatilize into the canopy and cause damage? And the other is, what are your thoughts, opinions, or concerns regarding volatilization?
Yeah. Okay. First question. No volatility with glyphosate whatsoever. Not even on my radar screen. As far as volatility, volatility doesn't bother me that much. Direct absorption bothers me more than anything else. That's going to be my opinion on that. Drift would be something that would be an issue to me, and volatility could be a problem if you were next to a farmer's field. If he's spraying it on, and it's usually what happens more than anything is temperature inversions, where you get these lines where it's warm enough where these little particles get carried on that inversion layer, where you get a massive temperature change. Like if you have a cold front come in and the ground's been warmed up, like today, to 70 degrees, and then tomorrow it's 40, and they go in the spray, and early in the morning you can have temperature inversions, which can carry the drift particles into where you don't want them. So, but volatility can be a problem with 2,4-D, dicamba, any of the growth regulator herbicides. But with the newer herbicides that they've developed, I don't know how many people, if you've been exposed to this, but the newer dicamba formulation, which they were very concerned about, they made a formulation that was very low volatility, has very low volatility. And Garlon, I don't know if you know about Garlon, but there's a Garlon 4 and a Garlon 3. The Garlon 3 is an amine. The Garlon 4 is an ester. The ester can be volatile and move around, but it's such minor amount of particles get moved around. It shouldn't be a problem with woody plant material. Might be a little problem if you're growing tomatoes next to where you treated. So anyway, so good questions. But
Yeah.
anyway, go
One
ahead.
more question. If a known herbicide situation, is there any benefit in some cases to drench the soils and try to dilute or wash the chemical from the soil on a regular basis? Or what about if a chemical is freshly placed by a contractor and you hear about it, would there be the ability to wash it away before it's fully taken by the desirable woody plant?
Yeah, that's going to depend on another great question, but I'd have to ask lots of questions of what the herbicide was. It just depends. Like, for example, if you spray a tree with glyphosate, usually if you wash it off immediately, you're still going to get some type of activity. But if it's washed off immediately, you will get decreases in activity. But now, if you have a product like dicamba and it's treated next to the plant, like under the canopy of the root system of a plant, of a tree, it's going to absorb enough dicamba that it's probably not going to be good ending. But if it's only one application and you've only done it one time, you might get away with that and not cause much damage. But if you did two, it was on the third or fourth application, it might absorb enough through the root system that no matter what you do, you can't stop it. A lot of people ask about putting activated charcoal down. It's really, it just won't work, and it's just not realistic to do that in those type situations. If you all remember the guy that killed those two oaks at Auburn. It wasn't at Auburn, I think it was. And then they had put tebuthire on, which is called spike. He had sprinkled it around the two oaks there at Auburn and killed him. And of course, got arrested and announced it. I don't know if you remember all that. But if I would have told those people what to do, I would have just let the trees go and then see if they die or not. They ended up, I think, causing more damage going in trying to put activated charcoal and rescue them than they did. They ended up cutting them down. And anyway, I don't know if they would have made it no matter what they did. So, but no, that's some great questions. And, but at least I got you thinking, and that's great. So anyway, just want to talk about two other herbicides, just with two pictures here. This is a problem I ran into back in 2020. Unfortunately, the guy that dealt with blueberry weed control up in New Jersey wasn't there. The chemical company released this herbicide out for, it was pendimethalin actually, for blueberry weed control. And they really screwed the label up, didn't make it clear to the growers, told them they could use up to 6 quarts in a single application, which is not right. They can only use up to 2 quarts. A lot of growers are using up to 6 quarts. And as you can see, two blueberries that were the same size, one treated field, one not treated field, you can see what the herbicide did to the root system. That same thing can happen with trees. Obviously, I can't dig a tree up and show you that, but if you have a large a 12-inch caliper tree, the herbicide, the roots are growing out. If you damage those roots enough, you're going to start dragging that tree down. And it's really critical that I really don't recommend people put any herbicide under the canopy of any tree. I would highly recommend against that at all possible. You can get away with it with one application, you'd probably be fine. But in this situation, I wouldn't. You can see there were guys with 400 acres of blueberries that lost their crop, and it should have gone into a class action suit, but all the growers hated one another in South Jersey. So I've recommended they do that, but they couldn't do it. And then some growers got paid well, some growers didn't. But you can see the damage that can happen with the pre-emergent herbicides that aren't systemic, but what it was doing is killing all those feeder roots before they put that herbicide on, before the plants leafed out. When the blueberries didn't have any feeder roots, they couldn't grow, couldn't get water, nutrients, and ended up just not growing. I was going down the rows just pulling 6-foot plants out, which you shouldn't be able to do. This was a problem we had in Dimension. I've had several of these crop up. Dimension is a pre-emergent herbicide they use in, it's called Tower or Crew in containerized ornamentals and the landscape. So anyway, they were using this and causing all kind of problems. Dimension is a really strange product. It actually is a growth regulator herbicide we use as a pre-herbicide, but the guy was putting it on at probably 3-4 times the rate he should have been, and we're getting epinastic type growth, and it was damaging his trees. He lost a couple $100,000 worth of trees because of that. So anyway, they can cause problems. So, and I just wanted to let you know that. And then the future, you may be able, there's been several people come out with products where they claimed, for example, if the plant was damaged by glyphosate, you could spray a product on it and try to pull it out. I've done a whole bunch of experiments with different things. People have told me one was putting nickel compounds on where you had a nickel chloride and several other things that tried to pull it out, but I've been unable to do it with any of these snake oils that people have been selling. And I really think, for example, when you get damaged with glyphosate, there's so many things that are happening in the plant metabolically that you get these cascade of events that happen in the plant, and it's virtually impossible to pull them back. But I don't know in the future if they might be able to do that with certain herbicides and certain things that have been treated. So there's been a lot of, I've dealt with several, I call them snake oils, that didn't work, but there were some unique claims that they had. And that's why you have people like me out there, because I don't I don't try to push any products. I really try to seek the truth and find out if these things are true or not. And that's one great thing about government employees, is that we're out there to try to help you, even though some people in the current administrations that are out there are saying that we don't do anything. We actually do, and we provide a very good service to help people try to eliminate these things that come out and the claims aren't true. So anyway, but that's really all I have. I'm hopefully you got some of that out of this. It was really hard to try to make you understand a little bit about the herbicides and then what they can do to trees. But if you remember those 5 herbicides that I talked about, those are, I can tell you, 90% of the issues that I've had to deal with in the 20 years that I've really been dealing with tree damage and woody type material. So because it's real hard to divide out woody shrubs and trees, they react very similarly to the herbicides. Shrubs can be with more extensive feeder roots. Smaller plants can be damaged easier, but I think with arsenal it doesn't matter. That product has been very problematic with many crops and trees over the years that I've seen, and hopefully I pass some of that information on. But anyway, I can entertain some questions. I'm fine if you
Sure,
have any more.
yeah, I'm gonna ask some of the questions in that are in the Q&A, and while you're answering them, I'm also going to put, because we're close to the end of time, in case people have to leave, I'm going to put the form for the CEUs in the chat. So look in the chat for that. We will stick around for questions for a few more minutes. And also, I will send out a recording of this webinar probably tomorrow to anyone who registered for it. So if there's information you want to go back and review, or if you missed the end, you can review that. So look for that form in the chat for CEUs. So what is the best control for hackberry sprouts?
Let me see, for hackberry sprouts. If you're doing it in any type of ornamental bed, glyphosate is by far the best product to utilize that to actually try to control those. The other herbicides that I mentioned, you have to worry about collateral damage. So I guess best to describe it, I did a bunch of experiments in blueberry plots, abandoned blueberry fields, where they're trying to get them back into production, and they would have wax myrtle, oaks, pines in there, and I went through and painted those with a whole bunch of different herbicides. By far the herbicide, where you'd have a blueberry plant and then you'd have oaks and all those trees growing right next to them. So if you're in there treating those, by far glyphosate gave you the best control with the least amount of damage, which I call collateral damage, to the desirable blueberry plant, and that pretty much falls across the whole board with any ornamental. So with hackberries, that's what I'd recommend. If you can't pull it out, cut it and treat it with glyphosate.
What's the difference between growth regulator herbicide and growth regulator in essence?
Another great question. The best thing I could tell you is the rate. That's a great question. And because it's a naturally occurring compound. So think of them like steroids. Like, if you're lifting weights, if you take a bunch of steroids, of course, it makes you blow up like a balloon muscularly. And of course, you're probably going to have problems down the road with your heart and everything else. But it's the same thing with the growth regulator herbicides that we feed use as herbicides. Those same products can be utilized for propagation and different things at much lower rates. So, but the 2,4-D compound now, that's native in just about every plant material. I think any woody type vascular plant, particularly woody plant material. But if you increase the rates, they do bizarre things to the plants, and we don't understand how they control plants very well. We don't have very little understanding on that, and I don't know if they'll figure it out before I die or not. But it's out there. So that's a great question. So we're utilizing those growth regulator herbicides, and for some reason, it's causing the plant to kind of grow itself to death. Even though people in my field get really mad at they don't like me using that statement, but that's kind of what's going on.
Can soil absorption be used to purposely kill invasive trees?
Soil absorption used to be invasive trees. So I'm assuming what you're asking, if can you put the herbicides on the soil to kill invasive trees? That would be a difficult thing to do. I would still do some type of herbicide application, hack and squirt. That's a really good way, because you're doing selective placement of the herbicide. And again, there might not be a lot of people that like glyphosate, but it's such an effective tool in that situation because of the lack of collateral damage to desirable plants. For example, if I paint a stump or do a hack and squirt application, if you're familiar with that, where you'd have you go around and cut the cambial layer of the tree and then apply the herbicide. If you do that with arsenal, that arsenal moves through the whole vascular system of the plant, including the roots. If you have other roots of desirable plants growing in that root zone of the treated plant, it can pick that herbicide up and die. With glyphosate, we don't have that problem, or a very limited problem with that. So I think what you're asking is, as far as you're asking, that you can do that, but I'd be too worried about collateral damage with that. And then I would utilize other means of applying do selective applications of the herbicide to be more precise and not cause damage to desirable plants.
Is dicot deactivated in soil? Is paraquat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't talk about those two herbicides, but yes, those two herbicides actually bond up the soil particles, and irreversibly they won't come off. In fact, if you know anything about paraquat, it's been eliminated out of third world countries because people were drinking it to cause suicide. So what they did is they made paraquat and made it an expectorant. So if you drank it, you throw it up immediately because it gets down in your squamous epithelial cells and will kill you. But in order to the antidote for it is to eat clay. So they have these little clay tablets that you take, and it bonds up the herbicide, and you'll poop it out basically, but it bonds up to that. And in fact, if you're utilizing dirty pond water and mixing diquat or paraquat, well, paraquat's the big one, that one will bond up to the soil particles and won't come off. And diquat will also do that, but not quite as powerfully as paraquat. Paraquat I don't utilize. I'm amazed it's still on the market because of the problems that they're having with it. With what's the disease it has? The shaking disease. Help me. It's Parkinson's disease. Sorry, Parkinson's disease, and then it's caused. There's a lot of implication that it's causing that when people didn't have the proper safety equipment. So that one, in fact, they made it so you're not even exposed to it when you mix it. Diquat is much calmer herbicide, and it's utilized in all kind of situations, but it can be the soil can bond that up and cause it to deactivate.
Any additional stories or info about herbicides leaching into unintended areas? Are some flowers and landscape plants more susceptible?
Um, it Most of the time, the big problems usually come from roadside weed control on leaching. When I first started, paraquat was utilized. They were utilizing it in North Carolina for roadside weed control, and it was leaching all over the place, getting in irrigation ditches. I was very concerned with dicamba when we had it actually got released back in 2018, I think it was. But in South Georgia, unfortunately, they have cotton and soybean rotations, and cotton they genetically modified so you could use dicamba on it. I was worried about the dicamba leaching into the irrigation reservoirs there that they utilize for drip irrigation and frost protection of blueberries. And anyway, I don't know if you heard, dicamba got pulled last year, so it kind of fell off my radar screen. But I'm still concerned with it accumulating in water. There's all kind of problems. In fact, me and the row crop weed scientist guy can probably get into it a little bit because I don't agree with everything he's saying, and then I think we need to do more testing. But the problem is, I was testing water. They were, and knowing that they should find some dicamba in it, they kept coming back negative. So I started spiking the samples with dicamba, and they started coming back negative. And it was all because the water was really tepid, or what I want to call dirty water with soil floating around. I think the dicamba was bonding up to the soil particles. They were pulling it off when they were filtering it to run it through the machinery. So I was kind of disappointed that it's kind of hard to find the dicamba in the water. And actually, we probably would have to go back and use bioassays to identify that there was something in that water, because we can utilize tomatoes for that, and they can identify dicamba up to 10 parts per billion in the water. If you water a tomato plant with contaminated water, 10 parts per billion, for about 3 to 4 weeks, it'll start manifesting dicamba symptomology.
Okay, one last question, and you're gonna have to bear with me on this because I have no idea how to say this word, so I'm sorry. Any damage caused by trees by sulfonylureas?
Oh, sulfonylureas, I think is what you're
There we
saying.
go.
Yeah, sulfonylureas, man, there's all kind of problems with those. God, I could tell you all kind of stuff. But anyway, back in the early 90s, sulfonylureas, there was a sulfonylurea contamination and a fungicide called betylate, and they were spraying it on all kind of plant material, orchids, all kind of things. And it's very toxic to, several of them are very toxic to woody plant material. There are some that are not that bad. There's one for controlling yellow and purple nutsedge called sedgehammer. That's actually a sulfonylurea. You can spray that around the base of the trees to kill the yellow and purple nutsedge, and it won't harm the trees if you only utilize it one time. But if you put multiple applications on for a couple of years, yes, you can have problems with it. But it all has to do with the structure of the herbicide molecule, the soil pH, and that it's amazing to me as I came up through this field. If they start changing the molecules on that herbicide, you have like a herbicide backbone that makes that sulfonylurea herbicide. If you change the methyl groups on that herbicide molecule, you can increase the activity immensely, making it one herbicide molecule might be fine to use around trees, and another one like sulfosulfuron will kill everything. And it's just minor changes to that molecule. And it has to do with how it docks into that site, and it gets really confusing and beyond my knowledge. I'm not that smart of a chemist to know that. So anyway, but it depends on the herbicide molecule and the situation, the tree species or the plant species, the tolerance to it, and actually the growing conditions. The soil pHs are so critical, and hopefully I beat that in your head of how active matrix the soil is. Such an active matrix that interacts with the herbicide molecules very much, that people don't really think about.
Well, Mark, we have gone well over our time, so I appreciate you taking a little bit of extra time to answer some of the questions that we had this evening. Again, the link for the CEUs is in the chat. I'll send out a recording of this. I look forward to seeing everyone next month for our monthly webinar, which will be a lunch and learn. Again, the topic's going to be arborists and landscape architects working together. So I hope you'll join us for that. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. It was greatly appreciated. You covered a lot in a very short period of time. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you soon.
Great, thanks. I appreciate it. And send me that about we talked about earlier. If you think about that, or if you post it, I'll keep an eye out for it. Hopefully I pass the knowledge. Oh, great. Hopefully I pass the knowledge on, and you'll try to learn more, because I try to learn more all the time. Anyway, thanks. See ya.
Thanks, Mark. Have a great evening.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.
Yep.